So 2020, yeah, has been a strange year for all of us. The uncertainty was unbelievable. So we got into a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty has happened, the lockdown. So that's affected our mental health. So if we go on to the next slide, Jane, thank you.
I will now, one moment, just to share and remind you again with Menti, has 2020 taken a toll on your mental health? Any of the answers that you give via Menti are going to be completely anonymous, so feel free to be as honest as you dare.
As honest as
2020 has been one heck of a year, and while a lot of people are returning to normal, we really don't know what normal is going to mean for us for the future. Things are going to be different, and we're still trying to figure out how that's going to look and how the new landscape is going to be. So workplace well-being, absolutely so important at the moment.
Yeah, it's so vital because there's so, having working with people in the corporate environment now, it is really, really very important to be looking after their staff mental well-being, because it actually will boost productivity. It will actually improve going into work, the quality of life that you have in the workplace, and more or less it will improve communication with all employees and resulting in lower stress. So it's very important now that companies begin to look after their workplace well-being, and with the companies or people that I'm working with, I'm glad to see that it's happening. So Julian, if you can do the next slide there, that'd be great. All right.
On the workplace wellness, yes, absolutely, it is up to workplaces to provide a culture of wellness, but it's also down to individual responsibility. Really and truly, you can take charge and take power of your own well-being, and it's very important that you do so. Regarding the workplaces, we were just having a chat with Christina before admitting you in from our waiting room, and we were talking about all of the resources that Iconic are putting on. That there's pretty much an event every day, or most days anyway, available. And that in itself is a fantastic resource. Sometimes we do not know the resources that are available to us. And I know when we started in Under the Rainbow on Capel Street, I moved locations. So one of the big things for me was to find new walking and running routes in my new workplace location. So there are hundreds of resources available to you that you can look up what is available already, whether you're working from home or whether you're working in the office, because all of these little resources that you can collect and find for yourself help develop your own sense of well-being and your own resilience. So you can look up things like your local healthy eateries, your local walking/running routes. If you use something like Runkeeper or Map My Run, there's routes that are already available on that. So there are a lot of local supports, even the events run by the workplace, by Iconic, and other events that might be available to you, either online or in person. And I know on person it's a bit slower to come back, and because of the whole social distancing and the allowance of people per how many people are allowed in a space, but there are still so many amazing free or low-cost online events as well. So when we're talking about workplace well-being, it also includes personal responsibility and stepping up and stepping into that space of self-care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain without getting too bogged down by the whole neuroscience part. 80% of our thoughts are automatically negative. But basically, the reason we have what's called a negativity bias, and if anybody here has ever read a book or been to cognitive behavioral therapy, they'd be familiar perhaps with this term negativity bias. And it's just, to put it very simply, it's how we've evolved. It's needed for evolution, and it's needed for survival. And every one of us are on this call today because some cave person somewhere ran for their life. So we are wired to survive. And that is something that we have in spades. We already have resilience. We just don't really know just how powerful we are. But our brains are naturally wired for worry, so that we can evolve and we can avoid dangerous, overwhelming, stressful, and threatening situations. If it's a case of eat or be eaten, we're going to run for our lives. So that negativity bias actually helped our ancestors and even helps us today make intelligent decisions in very highly stressful situations. So unconsciously, we're always scanning for danger and threats. It's there anyway, this sense of hypervigilance in the background, looking out, safe or not safe, stranger danger. Our brains are doing it anyway, even when we're not aware of it. But what that basically means is we're not pre-programmed with happiness. We're pre-programmed with an ability to scan for danger and learn about threats, which can leave us in a little bit of a difficult situation when it comes to if our brains are automatically thinking 80% negative thoughts. Well, then how can we be happy? Well, you can. And I know there's a lot of buzzwords around the term positive psychology lately, and please, please, please do not confuse this with toxic positivity. They're very different things, and I'll explain a little bit how. But positive psychology is actually a scientific study that's been proven to boost an overall sense of well-being. It does not mean fake it till you make it. It does not mean I'm happy and I know it, clap my hands. It is literally the scientific study of practicing positive thinking to wire your brain so that instead of 80% negative thoughts, it might become 70% negative thoughts. And that difference can be absolutely massive in your overall health and sense of stress and sense of well-being and overwhelm, and how you deal with day-to-day coping mechanisms and coping skills through life. So on this slide, I have some bullet points of how you can actually, the practices you can embrace to rewire your brain and literally lay down new neural pathways that'll connect and boost happy and positive experiences. Now, here's the thing, we don't remember the positive experience for the most part, because in a way, evolutionary, there's nothing to be gained from us remembering the good. Now, you could argue that in an age of where we're trying to embrace kindness and compassion, it is needed. But for example, if you go to the supermarket and you find a space right up at the gate and it's a Saturday afternoon and there's a space, someone's pulling out just at the main door of the supermarket, and you're like, brilliant, and it's lashing rain, so you take that spot and you're like, this is great, and you bounce into the supermarket all happy going, I'm parked right at the door, this is fantastic. If you're coming home from the supermarket and somebody cuts you off at the roundabout, that's what you're going to remember, because that's the threat, and that's where the evolution kicks in. So when you come home and you're unpacking the messages at the shopping, sorry, the messages are so Irish, but you're unpacking the shopping, you're going to be effing and blind and a curse that person who can't drive and pulled out in front of me and nearly cost my life, and stupid drivers. You won't remember the good Samaritan who gave you that parking space or whatever. Your brain will automatically remember the bad experience, especially if it's triggered survival instinct. So if you got a shock or a fright, then you'll remember the negative experience. We need to train our brains to remember the good and become happier and more grounded overall, people who naturally have well-being attitudes and attributes. And you might think, oh, who are these two going on and on about it? Trust me, Dermot and I have been studying and practicing this for a long time, and we've had to, and I know you'll agree with me on this, Dermot, we've had to practice these preachers ourselves. We've had to live these experiences, and the training of becoming a psychotherapist is literally rewiring your own brain. So if anybody had known me 14 years ago, and I remember my aunt saying to my mother, she hated being in my company. I was the most negative person she'd ever met. The opposite said about me now, but I had to actively train my brain. And I now have a much more positive outlook on life. So even that question I asked on the Menti, do you have a more positive or more negative outlook on life? You can change that. It doesn't have to be just one way or the other. So very quickly, focusing on strengths. We all have strengths. There are some really effective tests that you can do online if you're not quite sure what your strengths are, to learn more about your general strengths and what you already are working with and what you already got going for you. Gratitude. Everyone talks about the practice of gratitude. There's a reason for it. When you're grateful and you appreciate things, you're rewiring your brain. Noticing and saying out loud, thank you. It's not just a case of noticing in your head. The idea of the rewiring of the brain, and the reason I say savor happiness, appreciate the good, practice gratitude, And experiences over possessions, each of these things, you can embed the positive impact of these experiences by talking about them, by writing about them. It's not just a case of being in the moment and taking a selfie. But the more you cultivate and nurture that positive experience, the more it'll actually tilt your brain towards positive rather than negative. By the way, jump in with any questions at any stage. We'll try to get to them throughout the talk. Otherwise, we'll just get to them at the end, but feel free to fire away with any questions you have on this. So we've 4 chemicals in our body, or hormones, that make us feel happier. They are dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, and we can actually hack each of these things. You can't feel happiness all of the time in the way that we're kind of perhaps imagining it here, because if that were the case, we wouldn't recognize when we actually were happy. Our happiness would become our new normal, and we'd still be striving for those better moments, because that, again, it's our evolutionary piece. We're always going to be striving for more. And yes, I know there are a lot of practices about being here and now and being mindful and be grateful for what you have. That is great, and I agree with those and support those. But our evolutionary part of our brain that's wired to survive will always want a little bit more. So we can hack ourselves, but we can dip in and out of these chemicals and produce these ourselves to give ourselves just fleeting moments of happiness, which is actually enough, because that's all you need, is a fleeting moment of happiness to give you an overall better sense of contentment. So in terms of how you can access each of these, I've given some hints there, and I hope nobody's mind, but dopamine, meditation, hope, and a healthy lifestyle. Looking forward to something, planning something positive. Looking forward to even attending the next talk, the next walk on your lunch, what you're going to have for your lunch. Little things where you have positive experiences and you're actually kind of anticipating something positive. That will boost your dopamine. And it's actually one of the easier hormones and chemicals to tap into. The problem is, one of the problems, and I'm sure everybody's heard of a thing called the dopamine detox, is by using the likes of social media, or by having coffee, or by, if you smoke, or having sugar, or what are considered addictive substances, we're tapping into dopamine, probably unconsciously. Whereas if you deliberately plan something exciting that's healthy and good for you, it's a much healthier way, and a way where you have control over your own dopamine as well. Oxytocin, pets, touch, orgasms, kindness, self-hugs, baths. There are lots of ways to boost oxytocin, and I think I'm very curious to see the long-term studies that are going to come out about what COVID has done to us in terms of our development and evolution, because of the oxytocin starvation we're probably globally under at the moment with social distancing. And people perhaps don't quite realize that you can boost oxytocin yourself. You don't need to necessarily be interacting with other people, but you know that vibe sometimes when you're in a crowd and you just get that kind of atmosphere and it impacts your mood. That's oxytocin. But you can give yourself an oxytocin boost. Bubble baths and self-hugs, the most simple way to do it. Serotonin, everyone's heard, I'm sure, of serotonin. It's the most common ingredient in antidepressants, but you can boost your own levels of serotonin by looking after yourself, literally by eating healthier. And I know you're probably all groaning, but the connection between food and mood is scientifically so connected that we really can have such an impact on our depression/happiness levels by what we eat. And I know Dermot as well has studied this and does a lot on sports psychology and be well aware of how good food equals good mood. Self-care as well. If you feel good about yourself because you're worth it, you know, what is it, the Pantene ad? Because I'm worth it. Even saying things like that and appreciating yourself can boost your serotonin. And endorphins. Dermot's an absolute expert on the endorphins for sure. How many marathons have you run? 4?
I do. You just break it up. The IT is not working well for us today, but we'll keep on going.
4 marathons, I think Dermot has run.
I have, yes. Yes, 4 marathons. I got plenty of endorphins after that. Loads.
So you don't have to be as fit as Dermot. You can access your serotonin, your endorphin levels from simple exercise, a walk.
Yes.
And I do groan. What's it, people say, oh, if you have depression, go for a walk. As a therapist, that's such a bugbear. There's a hint of science behind that, but you don't cure depression by just boosting endorphins. But you do get an endorphin boost, and going for a walk can do that. But please don't think we're at any way saying that physical exercise cures poor mental health or a mental health issue. However, by hacking your own endorphins, by going for a walk or crying or laughing, you can absolutely boost your mood. Self-awareness. When we were training to be therapists, and we actually trained in different colleges, we met when we were both working as therapists in a therapy centre. But I thought I was self-aware until I started studying to be a therapist, and I don't know, I talk about this at length. I was sitting on my balcony with my cousin, and I was given out about the job I was in. I was in risk management, and I was just long days and a few Saturdays, and I was given out about, I'm going to have to move again. I'm going to have to send off the CV again. And my cousin said, how long do you kind of stay in a job before you move on? And I said, well, I don't know. What kind of a question is that? Now, I was in like my professional career, it was about 13 years, maybe 12 years into my professional career at that stage. And I was thinking about the question. I thought that was a really strange thing to ask. And then it dawned on me, maybe about 1.5 to 2 years. And then I moved on. And she said, do you not think the common denominator is you? Maybe you don't like what you do. Whereas I'd always said, oh, it was the manager, it was the job, it was the commute. And when she said that to me, it was one of those light bulb moments where I realized, oh my God, I absolutely hate being in credit and risk. And if you're in credit and risk, it's absolutely fine. It just wasn't for me. And Dermot was in a different aspect of financial services. But again, so we've both come from a financial background. Yes. So self-awareness, it's taken me since that point, and I would have argued before then, my life's work to kind of have an understanding of what self-awareness is. And I'm still learning. But if you're curious or interested to get to know yourself a little bit better, and there's always those dark corners and stones you can turn over to get to know yourself a bit better than you do already. These 5 things, I would just sit down with a pen and paper and write out these 5 things. So what are your values? What are your goals in life? What limits do you have, both intentionally and unintentionally? Like I physically cannot fly. None of us can, but that is a limit I have. I would actually really love to physically fly. I hate the 2-hour before getting on a plane, that process of just having to kill time and the commute to the airport. A flight anywhere takes an entire day. If I could physically fly, it would be so time efficient. I hate traffic as well. So that's a limitation I've no influence over, but I have other limits, such as boundaries and my own limits that I'm aware of that I have influence over. Purpose. Have you a purpose in life? Do you need purpose in life? Does your life have meaning, or do you want it to? And if it's something you want that you don't have, that's something perhaps to explore. And what are your needs? A lot of the time we go through life without even asking ourselves what are our needs. Yeah. So Dermot, I know you probably talk a good bit on self-awareness as well.
Yeah, no, I totally echo what you're saying there, Gillian. And it's funny in my life when, dare I say, I'm glad I got depression, because it opened my eyes to my own self-awareness, because I was an accountant in a financial background and I was very successful there and I was going up the ladder. But probably luckily, dare I say it, that the recession came and lost my job and reached out for help and sought help, and then realized I had a passion for helping people and a passion to be a therapist. And so here I am. But I now know what it's like to be working in the corporate environment. I now work with a lot of people who are working in the corporate environment and working with them and passing on my knowledge. So be self-aware and work. If you are now listening to this and working in the environment, the corporate environment, as we say, how are you with failure? Do you embrace failure? Do you learn from your experience? So even for me today, now this morning, it didn't work, the IT, but now I want to know what actually happened. You know, what actually happened there? Let's find out so I can move on and progress when I do more presentations. Again, also, I used to not want feedback from other people, particularly managers. I took it to heart, but now I embrace it. It touches you where you don't see your probably faults, where you need to improve. That's vital now if you are working in a corporate environment, but also if you're self-employed. You need to set goals for yourself, as Gillian has mentioned, and monitor them and see how to be realistic. Are you reaching those targets? What actually is going on for you? Because a lot of people now that I work with are always blaming their manager or they're blaming the company, but no, go internally. And this negative, have a look inside. It's not the job, it's not your manager, something else going inside it. Do you have low self-esteem? Do you have low confidence? Do you not believe that you're capable of doing this job? Have a look, go inside it. And one thing that's really good, I found really beneficial, was doing these personality tests. And even in Under Rainbow, Gillian and Philip, our colleague, we did it recently, about a few months ago, and we found out how we work well. You know, Gillian and Philip are very, very creative. I am creative, but my God, Gillian and Philip are unbelievable with their ideas. And I found that that's their strengths, but my strengths will be very much financial and logical, and we work well together. So by doing this test, it verified why we work well together. And of course, it gave us our strengths and weaknesses, so we could all focus on it. And probably, as I said, my weakness would be I'm not as a creative, but I was able to say, recognize Gillian and Philip's strengths. They were able to recognize my strength in financial. That is no problem. I can just do an invoice. I can chase up debts and stuff like that. That's my strength. So that is one of the things you can look at in your environment and you're self-employed as well, to be aware of what your strengths are. Go internally and find them out and write them down. And particularly in work, which I'm finding working with people, and I benefited a lot from working with people as well, was the social events. Work can be a very social aspect, and by going outside the office, I now know it can be quite difficult, but we are coming out of lockdown. But previously, when you were going out and work with social events, you got to know the person more and find out who they are, you know, and that's really a great benefit for people out there who are working in the corporate environment, to go and take advantage of these social events. And if you're self-employed, have a look at these events and go to these events and networking and find out what other people are doing, how they're coping with this COVID, and you get ideas and you bring them into work yourself. So there's a lot, self-awareness of work can great, really benefit for once you're self-aware of what's going on inside for you. So Gillian, if you go on to the next slide, thank you. 100% I am advocate of compassion for colleagues right now. We really are we've gone through an awful lot together. And perhaps the boundary was becoming a bit blurred now, where on the offline world, you left work and your colleagues had their life. Now in the online world, let's say the boundaries are becoming a little bit blurred because you're now seeing into their kitchen perhaps. You're now seeing into their family, like those who have, I don't have children, but I've worked with people who have children and their little child comes into the room. Or even if they have pets to come into the room, you know? So it's even an opportunity to connect more with people, you know, that you're actually finding more about the person working online. There may be cultural differences. There may be a lot of stress that they're going into, that they're working with, that they have to now probably say that they've got more commitments by working online. A lot of stress is coming in that they need to be probably now aware of. So compassion is vital. First of all, have compassion for yourself, know your own strengths and weaknesses, and not be too hard on yourself, because the online world and the situation that we're all in is quite tough, can be. So have compassion for yourself first. And then you will have compassion for other people, or the situations that they're going through. Other probably ways of working may be different, but having compassion for your colleagues is now vital in this uncertainty world that we're living in. So Gillian, if you can go on to the next slide, that'd be great.
One of the things that we've definitely noticed, it's coming in our therapy room, and it's coming in a lot of our presentations. And it's even coming in our own premises. We run a centre on Capel Street, is the idea of boundaries. Now, boundaries is something, it isn't new, but it's something definitely my parents are not aware of the concept. So I jokingly say my family don't have healthy boundaries. And it isn't that they don't have healthy boundaries. We've never until I began to do work around, funnily enough, around consent. That brought up the conversation of boundaries, and it became a family discussion, and we realized we'd never established general boundaries. And I'm talking about when somebody says, oh, well, you organise that party for your granny, you just will, instead of saying, no, this is my boundary, I don't really like her very much. Now that's an example. But the idea of setting boundaries seems quite new. And I do think historically it comes from this idea of fear and oppression, which is kind of awful. But when you look at all of the people that I'd say, and I don't like using the phrase, but to just give you an idea of the age set that millennials are sort of rebelling against, are the very same authority figures that my parents or the older generation would have revered and feared. So the likes of bankers, politicians, priests, medical staff, all of these things, the power dynamic has shifted entirely. And it's because people are now looking at boundaries and questioning what is and isn't okay for them. What are your personal limits? Going back again to that self-awareness. That aside, it's now a huge thing regarding COVID because people have different boundaries. Some people are saying, oh, do you know something? I'm sick of this. I just want to go back to normal. I really miss my work colleagues. For the sake of my mental health, I need the Friday pints, and I need to go out for lunch, and I need to get back to normal, and I need to go on a holiday. And that's okay. But that mightn't at all be where somebody else is at. And we're all trying to discover this sense of normal because we like routine. Human behavior, we like our routine. It means we're not scanning all the time. Like I was talking about earlier, that different environment, when we're in an evolution state, we're in a state of change. When we are comfortable with the routine and everything is familiar, our brains aren't working so hard. So we're not as stressed or as overwhelmed. So I can understand absolutely why, on a psychological level, there are huge divides on the pro and anti-mask situation. And I'm not here to talk about that. But what I am here to talk about is the differing boundaries. So it's something we've talked about in Under the Rainbow. We've gone in with a measuring tape and measured out our space and had to put down physical boundaries in terms of how we work with people. And then we had to talk to the team on who is and who is not ready or prepared or okay with coming back into the workspace. Respecting everybody's individual boundaries, because you don't know what's going on for somebody at home. You don't know what their own belief system is. And you also don't know about their own internal workings of their health, physically and mentally. And the idea that, and like, for example, I have somebody at home with a very recently diagnosed autoimmune disease, and there's other things happening and they're awaiting surgery. Doctor's orders are there to cocoon. So our whole household is still cocooning. Whereas my sister is quite the opposite. My sister has 3 children, all quite young, and my sister just can't wait to be back doing social things and having her holidays and having her space. So at the moment, my sister and I, who are actually best friends, are at the complete opposite ends of boundaries in regards to what is and isn't okay. And we've had to have some very uncomfortable conversations initially with, this is a boundary for me, please respect this and don't ask me to do that. So the idea of what a boundary even is, if the idea of setting a personal boundary is a new concept to you, again, I'd go back to that self-awareness piece. And boundaries are basically the rules and the limits that we set ourselves, but we often do it unconsciously. And we rarely have boundary discussions. So usually the only way we'd know if a boundary is being breached is when we have an emotional response. So it's after the fact that somebody's breached our boundary that we then get triggered and have an emotional response, and we'll say, oh, they shouldn't have done that, and that's not okay. But I would challenge you to look at, well, at any stage was your boundary communicated? Were you even aware that this was a boundary? So when we wrongly make assumptions about each other, that's one of the best ways to find out what your boundaries are. But by looking at your limits and your values, and I would even say, sit down with a pen and paper and write out things like, under no uncertain terms, would I? And just see what flows with the pen, because that's where you'll find your boundaries. I will not allow people to, and again, see what flows with the pen. because that is where you're going to tap into your emotional boundaries and your boundaries on what you need to do in order to protect yourself. Because it's all very well and good sitting and having the conversation of the concept and the theory of boundaries. We all have boundaries though. Sometimes we've never really looked at what they are. So we're very poor at articulating them and we don't even know what they are ourselves. So we can't expect somebody else to hold a boundary that we haven't stated. Now, there are obvious ones, like, for example, consent being an obvious boundary. But there are less obvious boundaries, such as, is it okay if we both get in the lift in a workspace or in any space? Is it okay if I sit beside you? And I'm not even talking about during COVID times. Do you ever get on a bus and the bus is half empty and somebody sits right beside you when there's another full empty seat? You know that sense you get? That is an internalization of what you feel or perceive to be a boundary violation, and it can be very uncomfortable. So when somebody breaches our boundaries, it can feel very uncomfortable. The problem is we're so used to just shutting up and putting up. We're nearly conditioned or bred in many ways for compliance that we don't call people out on, I'm sorry, I'm uncomfortable with this behavior. So here are some tips on how to articulate and manage your own boundaries. First of all, to know what they are and manage them yourself. If you say to a manager, for example, or someone you work with, I will not respond to work messages on a Sunday. Well, then manage your own boundaries. That is not okay then for you to break those boundaries and start messaging your team or your manager on the Sunday. If you set those rules, you have to be consistent yourself in adhering to them. And that is probably one of the harder parts of boundary setting, is to practice what you breach. Use I statements. When our boundaries get breached, we react. Rather than react, even to put it in a phrase of, I don't feel comfortable when, I am putting this as a boundary because this is how I feel. So there's no blame, there's no accusation, there's no attack. And it is okay to say no. It's uncomfortable, especially if you've been a people pleaser and a yes person until this point, but it is okay to say no. It's up to you whether you feel you have to explain or justify. And even regarding the philosophy of boundary setting, there are mixed thoughts on that. It depends on the relationship you have with the person. But to communicate clearly as well, saying this is a boundary, please respect my boundaries, or I will not be coming over to your house for dinner at this point in time because A, B, and C, please respect my boundary. When you say the sentence, please respect my boundary, it adds a more serious tone to the request, because think of the classic Mrs. Doyle. That's the way Irish mentality is. Go on, go on, go on. We are renowned for having very rubbery arms. We can be coaxed into pretty much most things. Whereas if you say the phrase, please respect my boundary, there's no Mrs. Doyle in there. There's no, sure you will, just a little bit. Because somebody has been communicated something that implies a very firm limit. And you don't have to be very firm in even saying that sentence. So another thing as well is to name a boundary violation, and this is the most uncomfortable part of all. So if somebody does break your boundary, to point it out there and then. And this goes back as well to how our brain works. If you don't, like say for example, the obvious one, like I will not communicate with work or with colleagues on a Sunday, and somebody contacts you on the Sunday. You will sit and stew and say, they've no respect, they don't listen, they've broken my boundary, no matter what I've done. And you'll go on in your head making a big negative, and that will embed in your brain, because how our brain works is the more we think about something, the more the neural pathways get formed. So that embeds the negativity in your brain. It means you're more prone to stress, you're less prone to well-being. By dealing with it there and then, even though it might bring up an initial emotion of anxiety, your heart might be pounding, your mouth might be dry because you don't want to be seen as the bad person here, by having the conversation and saying, look, I'm just responding to you to tell you that this is not okay. I would appreciate if you could respect my boundary and not contact me on a Sunday. You'll probably feel sick with the first time you having that conversation, but then you can let it go. Then you can let it go. The boundary is now set very, very firmly, and that's okay. You can get on with your weekend without being angry. You can get that flood of adrenaline and then the relief and say, I've taken back some of my power. I've done this thing. Now that's a very simple example, but there are a lot of ways where when a boundary has been violated, it is more important to just say, hang on here. maybe I didn't articulate my boundary in the first place properly. Maybe you didn't quite get the message I was intending for you to get. Maybe you don't quite understand how I feel, but this boundary is just being breached here. And mind your own stress. The more stressed you are, the less tolerance you have for everything. We are so hypersensitive to any, and again, the perceived threat, but that can be somebody just sending you a text message outside of working hours. Our brain could interpret that as a threat. And if we're not managing our own stress, suddenly we're in this big overwhelmed space. We're nearing burnout, and it doesn't have to be a big stressful thing that it's tipped us over the edge. If you manage your own stress, then you are a much calmer headspace. You're not responding from a place of reaction and crisis. You're then able to see things a lot more objectively. Speaking of stress.
Yeah. Speaking of stress, and I reiterate the I statement, that was the most powerful thing I learned. And you need to look after I in the workplace first and most. And these techniques that we have listed here are exactly what we emphasize and to put in place. Take your lunch breaks. I'm working in an environment that they have a wellness coach, an EAP. If you need it, take it. Have a look at your work-life balance. Make goals for yourself. Cut off at 6 p.m. That's it. No emails. Put boundaries in place, as Julian stated. But communication is vital. It is vital. I've seen a lot of people struggle. They just, with communication, that they cannot say to their manager, my workflow is too much. That's what you need to do. You need to look after yourself. If your workflow is too much, then that's what you need to tell your manager. But self-employed people out there, Julie and I are definitely, well, we walk the walk, let's say. When we were well, we still are. We've got many hats in us, but we had to be very disciplined with ourselves. And particularly as one thing when Julie was mentioned about boundaries in place, me, for example, is I don't take this Tuesday off, but that's an exception to the rule. But normally I take Tuesday off and I take Sunday off. That's my boundary. And you have to be, because if you have a passion, which Julie and I say will agree, if you have a passion when you're self-employed, you love what you're doing, you work all day, you work all night, but by God, burnout will catch up with you. So you need to be really, really disciplined if you're self-employed. If you're working in a corporate environment, you need to look after yourself, you need to set your goals, you need to know what you want, and you need to be able to be confident to stand up and be voiced and be heard to your manager or whoever it is, colleagues, and say, workflow is too much, I'm finding stress. Because if you don't do that, you will get burned out and you probably will leave the job. But outside the job, what can you do? Definitely, Gillian and I pass on to all the people we work with, clients, and we practice what we preach. As Gillian has mentioned, I am a runner. So I love running, and that is my self-care. So I pass this on to people out there. Find your creativity first, whether it's drawing, art, writing, journaling is fantastic. We've mentioned gratitude. Gratitude is an incredible, simple exercise to do. Written exercise, that is. Exercise, running, walking, whatever it is, get out in the fresh air. Mindfulness is an incredible tool to use as well. Meditation, many people, I'm delighted to hear the people I work with, a lot of people I work with now, they're getting into meditation. Meditation doesn't seem to be the scary thing years ago that only strange people do it. It is vital now for your mental health, particularly as we state here, the uncertainty that we're facing. Meditation, and off you go. We are therapists. We have no problem about boasting how wonderful therapy is, and Julie and I definitely continue on doing our own personal therapy in and out. We definitely need it because in the field we work, we need to make sure that we are the best mentally fitness, as we say, the best ability that we are. So we advocate therapy. And again, I said in my last presentation, men, there's no shame in reaching out for your mental health. There's absolutely no shame. And I urge all men who are listening to this, if you are struggling, reach out for therapy. There's no shame in it. So Gillian, we do have another mentee.
Yeah, just on the mentee there, I'll show you the results in 2 moments, but that screen is still up and the mentee code is 512454. So to get a better connection, whether you work directly with each other or not, workplace communication is very important because we all want to be heard, but we're not very good at listening. So my top tips for communication, shut up. Seriously, how can you listen if you're talking? Says the woman talking right now. But to shut up and allow space for other people. To ask open-ended questions rather than tell. So even if you are giving someone an instruction, how about you make it a request instead of an order? It'll be received a lot better as well. Communicate in person, particularly where conflict is involved. And I know COVID has changed that and changed a lot of how we communicate. And I'm a little bit worried that for the future, this will mean that we will fall into the nice habit of communicate by email or avoid the communication altogether, because this is what we've gotten used to over the last few months. Where there's any kind of conflict or a difficult request or a challenging situation, it is much better to communicate in person, because you know yourself, we've all gotten that text message where we're wondering what the person's really saying and we're misreading the tone of the message. And you write back and you're being all aloof and standoffish, and suddenly you're having a row and you don't quite know how. Just because a text was misperceived or you didn't quite get the vibe of what was being said. Everybody's done that. To soften responses, and this is something that I found myself sometimes actively working on, particularly when I'm busy. If I'm busy and distracted and somebody asks me something, it's very easy to just give a command in response, because that's a lot clearer and efficient. However, and now with the increased voice messages that we're leaving for each other via WhatsApp and other means, it's a lot easier to send commands and very efficient but brisk requests. Whereas if we can perhaps just be a bit more human about it and soften the responses and be the person behind the voice as well, I think it carries through and people are a lot more then engaged with the person. Praise and recognition, obvious there, but we like doing things for people that we like, and we tend to like people who think well of us, because we all really want, at the end of the day, to be seen and to be important, or at least to be liked. So when somebody shows us that, you know, we are likable, we tend to do more for them. So in a workplace, it's very important that we do give praise and recognition, particularly where it is warranted. And own your own actions. Say sorry, no harm. Oh, hands up and say, oh, sugar, I was really stressed that day. Or, you know, I didn't quite know how to articulate my COVID boundaries. So to own your actions, say sorry, be a human being, and communicate more efficiently. And also to communicate while being present. When we're distracted and we're like, what? Yeah. You can't multitask. It's a myth. So if you're playing Candy Crush or you're scrolling Insta and someone's trying to talk with you, you're not giving them your attention if you still have that phone in your hand. It's about being present and focusing your attention on the where you want to give that specific attention. Now, last slide, and I'm aware of the time, so feel free to ask questions, but if you go to Menti, and I'm just going to flip the Menti, give me 1 second. And now, I would love, because the expertise we have, there's probably not a whole lot of new things we've spoken about today. Maybe you didn't quite know about the brain part before, but even in that, I could give a 2-day workshop on that alone. But the expertise is here in the room, metaphorically. So I'd love to hear your tips on creating positive workplace culture. And I think this is very important, particularly in a place like Iconic, where you're not all necessarily working on the same team. And I think that needs a little bit of an extra layer, because it's very easy to sort of say, well, you're not my colleague, I don't need to put any effort into creating that positive workplace culture. But yet it's even more important that you have that sense of community and belonging, because that in itself helps boost mental health and wellness massively.
Totally, Gillian. I echo that, absolutely. Connection is vital for mental health. And if you are self-employed, like self-employed can be quite lonely, and that you may find that you might be struggling a bit with the isolation, but Iconic events like this are great to boost mental health and the loneliness. And equally, as we said, you get many ideas that you can actually enhance your business.
So thank you very much, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We'll be hanging around just for a couple more minutes to make sure that we've answered all your questions, but that is our presentation done, and I really thank you for your time and attention.